Hello, and welcome to Writers Group Therapy.
I'm Tom.
And I'm Roshni. We're writers helping writers with whatever writing ailments you might have.
Whether it's related to your craft or your career, we can help.
Are you ready for your session?
The doctors are in.
So, Tom, what would you say is your biggest addiction?
My biggest addiction, I used to be addicted to caffeine, but now I think it's endlessly scrolling through TikTok and Facebook.
Well, I think you can guess what mine are.
Cats in Starbucks?
Pretty much, yeah. But honestly, I think, in the grand scheme of things, that's also probably pretty tame.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, how do we write convincing characters that deal with addiction? So today, to help us out with that, we've got Ted Perkins, a former Warner Brothers and Universal Studio executive, producer, screenwriter, and now author, who had a really unique way of dealing with his own alcohol addiction. He watched 100 movies in 100 days about addiction, and then he wrote a book about it called Addicted in Film. Ted, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, you guys. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Yay, we're so happy. So, full disclosure, Ted and I met actually on set a few weeks ago when you were actually working, I think, for another, like a mental health organization, right?
Yeah, I facilitate meetings for an organization called Smart Recovery, and they're a evidence-based secular alternative to Alcoholics Anonymous or 12 Steps. And it's growing in influence around the country, around the world. It's got offices in 21 countries and 14 languages. It's a very exciting organization. It's growing fast. I've been working on the marketing side of them. I do all of their videos. I built up their YouTube channel. I facilitate meetings for them. And I was actually doing a commercial for them, their new About video, which is going to go live pretty soon here. So there's just a great organization. And, it helped me in my own recovery. So I'm sort of giving back by working with them.
I'm seeing a theme here, but before we get into the recovery part, we should probably get into the how you got there part. So tell us a little bit about your Hollywood journey. You were a producer, you were an executive at some of the biggest places. How did you get started?
Well, it's a funny story, but this is all like 30 years worth of history. But I I worked in private television in Spain for a while, and I used to do some of the interstitials and interview shows, and I interviewed movie stars for Canal Plus, and I was part of their launch when private television started in Spain, which was a very exciting time. And I actually worked on the draft of the translation of the actual the law that actually established private television. And I thought that television was a very exciting industry to get into, and a need for content and small short form content. And so I started working with that. And then Warner Brothers kind of scouted me and said, "Oh, you should come work for us." And so I moved back to the States and I worked for Warner Brothers in the merchandising department. And then I got involved in international film sales. And while I was in international film sales, I wrote a script, and I had no illusions of selling the script, but I sold it, like my first script out of the gate, and I thought that was pretty cool. So I signed a multi-picture deal with the producers from a German conglomerate after that, and so I was like writing at night and then working during the day doing film sales. And I also got inside my boss's office and read every document that I could about international film financing and pre-sales, et cetera. So I learned a lot and did a lot of film sales, and that industry is pretty cool. And then I knew about a job that would just open up at Universal, and my friend said, "You've got to get this job." So they helped me get the job, and then I worked at Universal, and I had a really wonderful run working in the international production and marketing department. And we worked on huge films like Jurassic Park and Waterworld, and it was just a fabulous opportunity. And then I got involved in co-productions and acquisitions, and at the time, co-productions weren't that common. So we did the first. I spearheaded the first co-production ever done with mainland China, with China Film. We did one with Argentina, with Spain, with India, and I was the guy that was like getting into all these really exotic markets doing local productions. And cut to 20 years later, now everybody does local production, and it's so I was kind of like a little bit ahead of my time. And then I was then recruited to. I wrote some more screenplays, and I sold some more screenplays to like Searchlight into Lionsgate, and sort of like that was like my moonlighting job that paid great dividends. And I liked it. And I wanted to be like a full-time screenwriter, but it was too lonely for me, and I still liked having regular jobs, and I felt that I could do both things. So I kept on working into independent film sales, and eventually I got involved with a streaming company that started a streaming platform for Latin music, which was one of the first sort of Spotify-like digital rights distribution channels. And I got very intrigued with what would become streaming media and subscription-based, video on demand and subscriber-based video on demand. So I got involved in that with a couple companies, and I worked for a Chinese conglomerate. And then I got headhunted by a Chinese venture capital company that I'd worked with on the Chinese co-production. And then I started doing productions in China, which was just hilarious. And the film that probably most stuck out was Snowflower and the Secret Fan, which was a movie that was distributed by Fox Searchlight, and that was just terrific, And so my life has been like going back and forth to the Cannes Film Festival on, private jets and first class all the time, and just having a blast. And then things were going well, and I sold a bunch of scripts, and then there was some periods when I wasn't selling that many scripts, and then I got involved in the recovery sector, and I realized that there was a tremendous potential in that. So I've been doing that ever since, and now I'm dabbling in a bunch of things. And I've always wanted to write a book, so I decided now is the time. I have the time and the money and the free time to do it.
That is awesome. And I just have to make a comment on something you said way, way back in the beginning of your story. And I sold my screenplay right away. And I'm like, oh man, if only it was that easy. So we'll do a whole nother episode about how easy it is. I'm just kidding.
Well, you know what? I can tell you a funny anecdote about that, and it might actually inspire your listeners. And this is actually a true story. But so when I wanted to sell my script, I realized that agents wouldn't read it because I was a nobody. Nobody had read me before. And it's the chicken and egg conundrum that, all of the writers face. And so I realized that the only way around it was to figure out a way to get agents to read my stuff. So what I did was I took out a loan from my father at some ridiculous interest rate. And so what I did was I sent the script to 30 agents, and I told them that I was an independent film financier from Boston, and that I wanted to meet with them because I wanted to finance this film, and I was looking for movie stars that would sign on, and I would make offers as soon as they showed interest. And so the minute you sort of like wave money around, or they think that you're waving money around, then they will read your script and pay attention. So I had to take a bunch of like lunch meetings, and sometimes I would rent a Mercedes to make sure that they saw me parking my Mercedes, or had my Mercedes at valet parking, to make it seem, instead of my shitty old Honda, to make it seem like I actually was a film financier from Boston. I had to buy new suits and ties and everything. And I sort of played the part of this financier. And the reason that I knew film finance was I was working as an assistant in a company that did film financing and distribution. So I read all the contracts, and I knew exactly what I was talking about. And I knew, how the financing worked. And then, so lo and behold, finally, after doing this for a while, several agents gave me several pieces of talent. So we got Kim Cattrall, John Savage, Malcolm McDowell. I mean, at one point we had, a bunch of other people, like actors involved. We had, I can't remember, but it was a while back. Martin Landau was attached, who went on to win an Oscar that year for Ed Wood. I mean, there was like people circling the project all of a sudden, and for no other reason. I mean, it was a good script. Thankfully, it was like there was proof in the pudding. But I had to sort of like pretend to be somebody that I wasn't in order to get people's attention. And then the product sold itself, thankfully. And then a German conglomerate came in and just bought the whole thing, paid my producer's fee, hired all the talent, made the movie, and then gave me a 2-picture deal on top of it. So I kind of just walked the walk and pretended like I was somebody that I wasn't. But that's how I sold my first script.
Wow.
Okay, that is a Hollywood story right there.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I had someone give me the advice of you have to be your own like urban legend kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I just figured, why not? I mean, what's the worst that can happen? They find out that I'm not. See, the thing is, when I was working in independent film, it's all smoke and mirrors. People come in and say, I'm a billionaire and I want to finance this movie. And people believe them. They go to the Cannes Film Festival, and everybody's just talking bullshit 24/7. Only 90% 90% of what you hear on the Cannes Film Festival is complete nonsense. And the other 10% are the people who are actually making movies and getting shit done. The other 90%, it's all blah, blah, blah. I've got this film fund. I've got this tax break. I've got this equity financier. I've got mezzanine financing. I've got a pre-sale in a studio in Mexico. I've got this tax break. I mean, it's all smoke and mirrors. But the thing is, they're not bad people. They're not lying necessarily. It just means that they need somebody to say yes for those things to fall into place. Like I'm reminded of this famous anecdote, and I don't know how true it is, but that Steve Allen and Bill Gates were after a meeting with IBM. IBM said, Bill Gates had said, "Yeah, we've got this operating system. It's, we can deliver it next month. It's awesome. You're going to love it." And that was Windows. And then in the elevator ride on the way down, Paul Allen turned to Bill Gates and said, "What the fuck were you talking about? What operating system?" He's like, "Don't worry, we'll make it." So it was kind of like once you get to yes, then you make it so. And that's what the film industry really is on so many levels, is that you just need somebody to give you a yes with the promise of a future deal. And then that sort of obviates, your efforts and knows that you're going to get compensation. And that's just the way that the industry operates. It's all a dream, really. I mean, La La Land. It's all smoke and mirrors.
So yeah, this Hollywood story is just amazing, and like some of these Hollywood stories go, you get to that second act and things don't go right. And how did the your addiction come around? How did that develop? Was it just kind of snuck up on you through all the all the events and all the schmoozing and stuff?
Well, I mean, I don't know what proximity you guys have to the film business, and everybody has different levels. But even now today, cocktails and cocktail hours and drinking and socializing is a huge part of the job. And I was, the funny thing about it is that growing up, my father was in the foreign service, and it was our job. I lived in all these different countries, and it was our job to steal people's secrets and to influence political leaders and kings and queens and chancellors and prime ministers and spies. And we had parties at my house growing up every other weekend. It was my mother was constantly buying liquor at the store, and then supplying liquor to all these people that were drinking at our house. And so I was surrounded by that all the time. I didn't drink, but I mean, I was around it all the time, and I knew that parties were just a blast, and people would drink and they'd have a blast. And so, like most people, I carried that whole ethos into my adult life. And as part of when you work at Universal, like at one point I had to go to the Cap, which is sort of like this huge hotel, and this very expensive hotel in Cannes, and somebody had run out of money, and I had to bring like a stack of money so we could buy cocktails for Bruce Willis and a bunch of other movie stars that were partying up and promoting movies for us. And so drinking was just a huge part of the job. And when you're doing international sales, I mean, I know it sounds kind of like quaint, but like there's certain people that you just won't do a deal with, you until they get drunk with you. Like especially in Asian countries, like I remember doing business with Korean clients, and you literally had to go out and get totally shit-faced with them and make a fool of yourself. Same thing with Japanese. They go to the geishas and things like that. It was just part of and unfortunately, it's all very male bonding, sort of toxic masculinity bullshit. But it's part of the job. So I was surrounded by that, and then drinking alcohol is. I never did drugs or anything, but drinking alcohol is all great and fun until your life becomes less structured. And when you're a screenwriter, your life becomes less structured. And I was my own boss, and I had my own companies and interests, and that was less structured. So I realized I started like using alcohol to just like pass the time between deals, or waiting for people to read my scripts and then give me notes so I could then do the notes. So alcohol never influenced my output. In fact, some of the best scripts I think I ever sold, I wrote them when I was drinking. Not while I was drinking. I wasn't drunk while I wrote them, but like I was drinking at the time. And as I say, drinking is really, really fun until it's not. And everybody gets to that point where it's not at certain points. Some people never get to that point, but I got to the point in mine where I was like, this is not really helping my life. So I just quit. And so I needed some help doing it. So I turned to movies, and I got serious about it, and I went to mutual support meetings, and I got involved in SMART, and then I started facilitating my meetings, and now I help others in their recovery. And it's it's incredible volunteer opportunity, and it's very rewarding. It's sort of a way to reaffirm my own, belief in the perfectibility of imperfect human nature.
So going back a bit, you didn't have like I guess like that turning point moment where you're like, "Oh my gosh, I shouldn't be doing this." You just kind of woke up one day and were like, "Why am I drinking?"
No, I mean, everybody has their own sort of rock bottoms. Certain people have
Mhm.
like different rock bottoms, and I certainly had some bad episodes that happened that I regret, but none of them led to danger, and none of them led to any some hurt feelings, and I'm sure there's certain things could have gone differently, and but luckily I emerged from much of that unscathed. Certain people, it takes getting a DUI. Sometimes it takes a failed relationship or a breakup or a divorce or going to court or going to jail or killing somebody or what. I mean, everybody reaches a certain point of aha, and I'm lucky that I got mine fairly right away. And there's certain times when I said aha, and then I quit for long periods of time, but then I went back thinking, I can do this, and then I realized I couldn't. So everybody's journey with alcohol is different. And for anybody who still drinks to whatever degree, they're still on that journey. Everybody who drinks alcohol, even moderately, has the potential to at some point in their lives abuse alcohol. And I'm not saying that everybody's like skating on thin ice. That's not true of everybody. There's 90% of people can drink moderately or not at all and have perfectly wonderful lives and not have an issue. But for certain other people, especially if you grow up around it or you're genetically predisposed, or there's like a zillion reasons that you could come up with for why people drink to excess. Certain people can't. There's a wonderful movie that I talk about in the book called Another Round, which looks at the fact that drinking can be fun in certain circumstances until it's not, and it studies it from certain different angles with different characters. Um, and that's actually probably my favorite movie about the subject of alcohol use and abuse.
So now we're going to get into the actual book here. It sounds like you were doing a couple different things like the smart recovery and, the movies and whatever else, like
Mhm.
concurrently to get over your alcohol dependency. But why did you think that watching 100 movies was the best way to get over it? Like, why did you think that one of all the things?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily qualify what you said was entirely correct. Like, I didn't do a bunch of things to stop my alcohol addiction. It was like alcohol addiction was like along with working. I could still work, I could still make money. In fact, I think probably the most amount of money I ever made in a year was when I was still drinking. But I eventually, by stopping, I had more time on my hand because when you don't drink, you have a lot of more free time. And so I what I realized was that you can sort of dip your toe in the sobriety world, or you can go all in. And the problem I think that a lot of people have is that they kind of think that they're special and they can get away with it. That yeah, they're going to quit, but they don't need any help, and they don't have to read any books, and they don't have to go to any meetings, and they don't have to have a shrink. They can do it all on their own. They're perfectly strong. They're healthy. They can do it. I've got great willpower. I can totally do this. And most people fail. And I realized that I had to kind of take it a little bit more seriously than just you know, reading a book or going to a couple meetings and checking a box. So I started going to meetings, but I also and I read like a lot of books about addiction. I was interested because I'm an avid reader and I'm interested in neurology, biology, physics, and cosmology, and psychology, and psychiatry, anthropology. So I looked at all the reasons why people have drunk alcohol over the years or taken drugs over centuries. I looked into the all of the issues surrounding all the rich sort of like intellectual landscape around excess, even the philosophical aspects of stoicism. And I mean, let's not forget, like in the Temple of Delphi, inscribed in the Temple of Delphi is like seek moderation in all things. After know thyself, it's seek moderation in all things. So people had been grappling with this idea of excess versus moderation, and living a good life for many years. I thought, well, there's a great exercise here, and I wanted to learn more. And I read a lot of books, but I realized, there's some great movies out there, and I'm a movie guy. I might as well, box myself in and see a bunch of movies. So I saw a bunch of movies that I had blown off because, like, when I was working in the student, and nobody really wanted to do those movies. Like Train Spotting was great, but that was an outlier. Like drug movies are kind of a downer. Let's do a comedy. It was more like it wasn't a really good business model. But I realized that after I started seeing the movies, I could see parts of myself in each movie, and then I could see parts of my solution in each movie. And I thought they were just really interesting films to watch. And so I watched 100 movies. Some of them were horrible, some were great. And I chose 25 that I thought were really, really wonderful and really relevant. And those are the ones that I included in the book.
Did you actually think you were, hey, I'm going to write a book about these? Or was it just, I'm going to watch these movies first, and then later you thought, oh, I should write a book about this?
Oh, no, I watched the movies first, and then I realized, wow, this is really interesting. There's a lot of great movies. And then, in my Smart Recovery meetings and my colleagues at Smart Recovery, occasionally I would say, hey, people in the management, I'd say, hey, have you ever seen Lost Weekend? And he's like, oh yeah, that's an incredible movie. There's this guy who he put a list together of all the recovery related, addiction and recovery related movies that have ever been made. And he passed away. And he was like a professor at like some university in Texas. And they gave me a copy of his list. And I saw most of the movies that I had seen, plus a couple more that I hadn't. And then I checked those out. Then I realized, God, you mean nobody's written a book about this? I mean, this is really cool. I mean, why not? And so I was looking for a topic to write a book about. And I was confounded because I'm like, you should, and I didn't want to write a fiction book, because in fiction, I'm happy writing screenplays. That's my efforts in fiction are isolated to screenplays. I've already got that format down. I'm comfortable with it. I'm not really a good long form creative fiction writer. I mean, I tried that and I just didn't really feel like it was my thing. But nonfiction was, and I could find my voice in nonfiction. I'm a little bit sarcastic, a little edgy, a little snarky sometimes, and I wanted something that could reflect me as a thinker, but also something that I'm an expert on. So I figured, well, there's two things I'm kind of an expert on. One is the film industry, and the next is addiction and recovery. So why not just create a mashup of those two things and create a book, Addiction, Addicted in Film. So, it just seemed like a natural segue. Like it's so obvious that it was just smacking me across the face.
It's really interesting. I've seen the outline to your book and read a little synopsis, but we haven't actually gotten to see the book yet. It's coming out right as we record this. It's going to be coming out. So give us a little teaser. What are some samples of teachable moments you found most helpful from some of the movies?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, first off, I think, like, for instance, if you go early and you look at The Lost Weekend with Ray Milland, it's the first time that anybody really knew what alcoholism was. It was the first time that the national conversation about alcoholism had opened up. And so what's interesting from a historical perspective is that you look at like how they defined alcoholism, how the use of the word itself was new at the time. It was sort of like society's dirty little secret that had been swept under the rug. Nobody knew what delirium tremens was. It was horrifying. And, a lot of people had come out of World War II and were drinking a lot, and alcohol use at the time was really increasing. And, it's wonderful to see that film now in a historical context and then compare that to where we are now as a society. When AA had just started back in the day when this film was made, to where they are now, or where they are now, with like thousands or millions of adherents and how many people, and what the recovery industry and what drugs and alcohol is now, is very interesting in and of itself as a history lesson. And then when you see Don Burnham in The Lost Weekend walking around on a weekend looking for money so he can buy a drink, sometimes it reminds me of some of my stupid, weekends where I was like, oh, I've got nothing to do. I just got to find a liquor store that's open so I can buy some beer and just kind of do something with my time. And that sort of desperation of getting a next drink, or, when you have an alcohol addiction, you kind of plan around when you can drink and how you can procure alcohol to drink. And a lot of your day revolves around, a lot of your thinking revolves around that kind of planning. And it takes priority over other things. And that's scary in and of itself, because like when you're thinking about how you can get your next beer, as opposed to like, picking up your child from daycare, that's a problem. So, and that's what, a lot of times happens. And so when you see that reflected in a movie like Lost Weekend, it's sort of like a wake up call, because you think, okay, it's not just that guy in that crazy movie, that's me. And when you see yourself represented in three dimensions, objectively, not just subjectively in your own mind, because we all are so biased that we think we're wonderful people and we don't have problems. But when we see an objective reality reflection of ourselves with bad behaviors and all the ramifications, it's actually a very profound thing to see. So I saw a lot of that, and I say that in the book, and that there's great value in seeing people hit rock bottom, because, like, thank God that's not you, but it could be you. And actually, there's a lot of you in that person. So that's a kind of a cautionary tale. And that goes for a lot of the movies in the that I cover in the book. And, let's not forget that the story of alcohol and drug use and abuse is not limited to the people who are addicted. I mean, there's also the friends and family of people who are addicted, and how they help or try to help, or how they sometimes don't help their kids or their family members or their spouses. So I take a look at movies like Days of Wine and Roses, where you've got a dysfunctional relationship of two people who think they love each other, but they're really just in love with each other's addiction to alcohol, and they're just drinking buddies. Or you look at a movie like Beautiful Boy, where Steve Carell's trying to figure out how he can help his son, and he realizes that sometimes you just can't. Like, there's only so much you can do, and those are hard lessons for a lot of people in real life. And so to see those stories and those conflicts portrayed in movies, and seeing people deal with the dramatic issues and try to solve them in honest ways, not always winning at the end, sometimes failing miserably, and sometimes dying at the end, it's wonderful. And it's important to see that reflected in film, because let's not forget, stories are metaphors, and stories are the currency of our time, and they always have been. People have been sitting around fires telling stories since the invention of language. It's a very important part of how we see the world, and how we define the world, and how we model the world. And movies, really help us do that. And they're very therapeutic. At least they were for me. And I think that's what I'm trying to convey in the book.
So, two-part question then, following up on that. What was your criteria for picking a movie to put in the book or to help you in your recovery process? And what would be, in your opinion, the best and the worst movies representing like the recovery process, or like, the people around you or something? Like, what would be like, I would recommend this to someone trying to, get over this
Sure.
addiction, and I would be like, no, stay away from this movie. So there's your question right there.
All right. So what's the first part of the question?
What was your criteria for choosing
Oh,
a
okay,
movie?
right.
Yeah.
So, well, my criteria is that there are a lot of movies about drug and alcohol addiction that just show people, who are addicted to drugs and alcohol, and they die in the end, or they get well at the end, but not too much happens. There's not too much meat on that bone. And a lot of movies are just gratuitous eye candy of, like, people hitting rock bottom, or what you call addiction porn, which is basically, people love looking at a train wreck. People stop when there's an accident on the 405. Everybody's rubbernecking, because, yeah, you don't really want to see the accident, but you'd love to see the accident. And so there's a lot of movies that just glorify drug and alcohol use and show it as bad, but they have nothing really to say about how to recover, why the person got to be where they are, what it all means, what's more important, like a more redeeming message or a theme. And so I chose movies that have something, very interesting to say about, drug and alcohol recovery. Now, remember, drug and alcohol recovery is not like a set science. It's very much in flux. There's a lot of different opinions about how to solve the problem. And there's stuff going on in Washington right now that the recovery universe has been at odds with itself over several different issues for decades now. There's people that are on one side that say we need to, criminalize everything and put everybody in jail. That'll teach them. And then there's others that say, well, that doesn't do anything really. I mean, that's why the disastrous war on drug was such a disaster and cost $1 trillion and led to ruined lives and so many people in jail and achieved nothing. Now you've got, Portugal and Holland and Switzerland totally decriminalizing drugs and realizing that it's an incredible, way to save lives and help people, and actually reduce incarceration and save a lot of money, taxpayer money. And then you've got people in Portland who are decriminalizing psychedelic mushrooms because they have applications in alcohol use and abuse therapies. I actually got involved in one of those, and so with an industry that's so at odds with itself and so still learning as it goes, there's a lot of movies that reflect that sort of like dynamic conflict between points of view. And a lot of the movies that I talk about are ones where I could sort of extrapolate what was happening in the movie, and then have a deeper or longer or more meaningful conversation about all sides of the issue. So in many ways, I do talk about the movies, but I talk about the movies as a springboard to say, okay, this movie is a wonderful example of this issue, and I want to talk about this issue. And so that's what kind of like fills out the book, and that's why it was fun to write about, because if it was just a book about like, let's talk about leaving Las Vegas, I mean, it would only take me 6 paragraphs to really describe what the movie's about, and then it would just sound like a film review. But if I could talk about, the fact that that Ben Sanderson decided that he wanted to commit suicide by drinking himself to death, and that he was unable to find meaning in life, and that perhaps people with addiction are having an issue of existentialist problem of finding meaning in a world which is more fragmented and atomistic, and yes, we're so connected by social media, but we're more isolated than ever before, and the increasing levels of ennui and the mental health challenges exacerbated by coronavirus. I mean, if I could have a deeper conversation about how people are having a crisis of meaning in their lives, and that Ben Sanderson's decision is actually completely consistently logical with a personal decision to find out that, like, what, I don't want to fight anymore. I just want to go all the way to the end, and I want to go out the way that I want to go out. That's a very profound message. It's not something that a lot of people will agree with, because most people fight the fight. They fight their addictions, they come out the other side, and they don't commit suicide. Sadly, a lot of people do. But the conversation about the fact that alcohol abuse and drug abuse is like a huge critical indicating factor for prevalence for suicide is an important conversation to have, and guides a lot of public policy decisions going forward. So looking at leaving Las Vegas is, I think, a crucial part of having that conversation, and it opens up the opportunity of having uncomfortable conversations, because let's face it, drug and alcohol addiction are uncomfortable topics that a lot of people would rather not deal with. But you have to, especially nowadays when you've got, gazillions of people dying to fentanyl overdoses. The conversation has never been more relevant. And if movies help us have that conversation in an open forum that's entertaining, enlightened, didactic, and not too pedantic, then I think it's a win.
Well, it sounds great from when that, I mean, addiction's not great, but from that perspective, kind of how the book is being used to explain those things. It sounds like your book would almost be like a textbook for writers who are trying to understand addiction that don't have that firsthand experience, if they're going to be writing about it. Do you think that that's somewhat accurate in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I mean, if the focus of your audience is for writers who want to figure out ways to write and be successful and sell and write for the market, and be inspired, and also deal with their own demons, because let's face it, a lot of writers. There's a whole group here called Writers in Recovery. They have a film festival every year. In fact, one of the films that I worked on actually in the film festival, and but I think the crucial part is that writing is something that is very difficult. It comes from a place of like a deep emptiness in your soul that has to be filled and then conveyed and represented in art. And you're always faced with self-doubt. You never have the assurances that what you're doing is meaningful. It's meaningful for you in the moment, just like alcohol is giving you a sense of meaning and purpose when you drink it, or taking a drug makes you feel great, or meth makes you like a genius for at least 2 hours until you need more meth. All those things are what creative people deal with all the time. And so I think there's a lot of parallels into, looking at these films and looking at creativity and looking at writing are important avenues that I think writers can explore. And I'm not saying that every writer is going to become like an alcoholic or anything, but think about sort of like the ethos that we're surrounded by. That who was it that Faulkner was a huge whiskey alcoholic, and that Ernest Hemingway was a huge drinker, and that was one of the reasons he was so successful. I mean, the whole we're surrounded by these ideas that like you almost have to be an alcoholic to to be a good writer, or you have to suffer pain and addiction and withdrawal and to be inspired. None of those things are true. And I even talk about it in my chapter about A Star Is Born and Crazy Heart, which is a story about like, and the chapter is entitled "Mamas Don't Let Your sons grow up to be country music stars." Country music is saturated with alcohol. Like you're not taken seriously unless you have a drinking problem. It's
Oh yeah.
like one of those things.
Oh, that's
There's
horrible.
there's a tear in my beer. It's part of the whole. And let's not forget that alcohol is culturally relevant to so many cultures and so many creative cultures as well, from art to writing to everything. It's all bound up in that. And certain people think that you need to take psychedelics to become a better artist or writer or thinker or philosopher, and maybe that's true. Maybe that's part of the process. But everything has to be done in moderation, and everything has to be. People have to realize that if you're writing and you want to make writing into a career, you certainly can't be medicating through that process. I've learned that the hard way. It's you're much more productive and you can get more shit done. And I think ultimately you're a better writer the clearer head you have. Which is not to say that having some past pain and trauma and like life lived isn't good for you. It is, but like don't necessarily like look for a rock bottom just so you could write about it. Because that's a very expensive idea.
Yeah, seriously.
Well, this has been amazing, Ted. Thank you so much. So if people want to find you or find the book, how can they find you online? Where can they find the book? All that good stuff.
Oh, well, thank you for everyone who's listening. Yeah, the book is available. Well, you can get all the information about where to buy the book by going to Amazon and just do Addicted in Film by Ted Perkins. And it's available on all major book platforms like Barnes & Noble and Kindle. And, it's like basically like wherever you shop for books, it's going to be there. And if you want to get like a signed copy and join our movie club, you can go to addictedinfilm.com. So www.addictedinfilm, all one word.com. And we're creating a community of people who want to talk more about these movies and about writing and about creativity and about addiction and recovery. And so you join the movie club, and we'll have every month we're going to have a watch party where we watch a movie on Amazon Prime, and then we have a short discussion afterwards, or on Zoom. And so I invite everybody to be part of that community.
So make sure you check out Ted's book, and we will see you guys soon.